Questions. Questions are a rather common occurrence in our daily lives, are they not? In fact, I feel confident that each of us has already asked quite a few questions this morning, as well as, no doubt, we have been asked any number of questions. If you've been in our Bible class this morning, I know you have been asked a lot of questions because I was the one asking them. But please appreciate, friends, it was no different for Jesus. Questions was a common occurrence in our Lord's life. In fact, reading the gospel accounts, we encounter a lot of questions in those books of the Bible that document for us Jesus' earthly ministry. Now, that may not be very surprising to us. First of all, because remember, Jesus is the master teacher. And for any of us who have taught individuals or classes, you know questions are a valuable teaching tool. And so it probably does not surprise us that Jesus, as the master teacher, used questions frequently, regularly, and oh so very effectively. In fact, I have no reservations in asserting Jesus alone, exclusively, is the one person who used questions perfectly. But then, at the same time, please remember, Jesus is God in the flesh. And while he was here on the earth, friends, he was a captivating individual walking among the contemporaries of his day. And so it certainly would not be surprising for us to know that individuals came to Jesus and they had questions that they wanted to ask him. And so once again, as we discover reading through the gospel narratives, Jesus fielded a lot of questions during his brief sojourn here on the earth. Now, I mention this fact about questions because I would like to invite your attention this morning to a question that we find in the gospel record. This particular question is one of those that was posed to Jesus. And the question is this: by what authority doest thou these things? By what authority doest thou these things? Now, all three synoptic gospels, Harold, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three of them record this question being asked of Jesus. But I'm going to ask that we use Matthew's account. So if you would like, please open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 21. Matthew chapter 21. And again, for future reference, you can also read this in Mark chapter 11 and then again in Luke chapter 20. But again, let's use Matthew's account, Matthew chapter 21. We're going to read verses 23 through 27. Matthew 21, beginning at verse 23. And when he, Jesus, was come into the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, by what authority doest thou these things? And who gave thee this authority? And Jesus answered and said to them, I also will ask you one thing, which if you tell me, I in likewise will tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John, whence was it? From heaven or of men? And they reasoned with themselves, saying, if we shall say from heaven, he's going to say to us, why did you not then believe him? But if we will say of men, we fear the people, for all hold John as a prophet. And so they answered Jesus and said, we cannot tell you. And he said to them, neither tell I you by what authority I do these things. Now, having read the account, looking at the question, I'm going to ask us to look together and make some preliminary observations about the question in the setting where it was asked our Savior. But then, having done that, kind of laying a groundwork, Then we're going to embark on, and I'll say it, Ricky, a brief series of sermons wherein we want to try to derive some pertinent and practical and timely considerations from the question itself. But let's begin with those preliminary observations from the historic episode itself. And let's, again, kind of do this quickly, because I do believe these might prove insightful as we then turn our attention to the question by way of more general observation and consideration. So first of all, let's think about the context here. When and where does this occur in the life of Jesus? Well, friends, this is the last week of Jesus' earthly ministry. And you can notice, as we discovered there in verse 23, Jesus had entered into the temple. And as so often he has done in doing that, he is teaching the people that were gathered there. Angie, I thought it was interesting. Luke's account says not only was he teaching, he was preaching the gospel. Think about that. He was preaching the gospel to these individuals. And it was while he was in the temple, while he was teaching the people, that he is going to be approached and asked this question. So that's the when and the where, but who? Who is it that was asking the question of Jesus? Well, the individuals, at least here in verse 23, are identified for us as the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now, both Mark and Luke also mention the scribes as a part of this inquiring group of people. And as you well know, friends, these individuals, the chief priests, elders of the people, the scribes, friends, they were among the leaders of the Jewish people. These groups of individuals were those who were in positions of religious authority as appointed by and as arranged under the law of Moses. So we have when, where, who. Now let's address a what for a minute. And that what comes from the question itself. Listen to it. By what authority, they asked Jesus, are you doing these things? What things? What things were they referring to when they asked Jesus for authority for what he was doing? Now, I'll be honest. The text does not specifically enumerate what things they meant. But I do believe that we can probably safely conclude from the context at least some of the things about which these religious leaders wanted Jesus to answer by what authority he was acting. The first of those probably is the very activity in which he was engaged in. Remember, when they approached him, what was he doing? He was teaching. He was teaching the people in the temple. And so probably they were asking him, how is it that you have assumed this role of teacher, of rabbi, and are found teaching the people when they knew he had not obtained any official, credentials from their rabbinical schools? So I'm inclined to believe they probably were asking about that. How is it that he assumed to be a teacher among the people when he wasn't one of them? But notice it says things in the plural. So it seems to be more than just the fact that he was teaching. And so let me point to a number of other things that happened recently that they may have been inquiring about when they asked, by what authority, Jesus, are you doing these things? Matter of fact, if you back up to the beginning of this chapter, Matthew chapter 21, verse 1, friends, this happened just a couple of days ago. Again, this is still all within the final week of Jesus' earthly ministry. But it recounts for us Jesus' entering Jerusalem on a young donkey. And you remember sometimes we style that the triumphal entry. Now, even though it happened several days ago, I feel certain the religious leaders had this clearly in their mind. This was a vivid imagery, a scene that they would not soon forget. Because you remember what transpired. As Jesus made his way down the Mount of Olivet and were entering into Jerusalem, the entire path was crowded by people. And they were putting down palm branches, and they were throwing down their clothing, and they were shouting praises to Jesus. Praises like we see there in chapter 21 and verse 9. They were saying, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. And not only were they singing these praises and proclaiming these praises as Jesus made his way into the city, but they were also ascribing to Jesus very lofty titles. Again, there from verse 9, they were calling him the Son of David. Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. Luke's account says they were calling him the King. The King who comes in the name of the Lord. Friends, the religious leaders, at least some of them, witnessed Jesus' entry into the city several days earlier. In fact, Matthew does not record this, but Luke, in Luke chapter 19, tells us that the Pharisees, who you remember was another group of the religious leaders of that day, another among the Jewish hierarchy, and here's what they said when they heard these praises and these accolades, being bestowed on Jesus. They said, Master, rebuke your disciples. I can't imagine they weren't asking about that. But then also, please remember that subsequent to that, Jesus would enter into the temple. And friends, here was the second time during his earthly ministry that Jesus is going to cleanse the temple. Look there in Matthew chapter 21, notice verse 12, please. And Jesus went into the temple of God, cast out all them that sold and bought in the temple, overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves. He said to them, It is written, My house shall be called the house of prayer, and you have made it the den of thieves. Tracy Mark's account actually tells us Jesus would not allow anyone to carry any kind of vessel through the temple on this occasion. Again, I can't imagine, Harold, they weren't asking about that. Jesus, by what authority did you do that? But not only that, look at verse 14 through 16. And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. And so here is Jesus healing the lame, the blind, who were coming to him while he was in the temple. And once again, these miraculous healings, these wonderful works that brought such blessings upon those of the people, it incited praise and adoration. In fact, Matthew's account said from children. Look there in the middle of verse 15. And the children were crying in the temple saying, Hosanna to the Son of David. But he didn't get the same reaction from the Jewish leadership. In fact, when you back up to verse 15, the beginning, when the chief priests and the scribes, friends, those are the ones asking the question. When the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did and the children crying these things, the end of the verse says they were sore displeased. And they asked Jesus, Do you not hear what these say? You remember how Jesus responded? He said, quoting from Psalm 2, Have you never read? Out of the mouth of babes and sucklings, thou hast perfected praise. So, brethren, I would just like to submit to you, I believe it is likely all of these things, and maybe others that had occurred in this final week that prompted their asking Jesus as they now enter into the temple and encounter him there teaching, they ask him, By what authority doest thou these things? And who gave thee that authority? All right, well, with those introductory considerations, let's pivot now in our study to making some more general and again, hopefully very practical and relevant and timely observations regarding this. Friends, and I would submit this is a question of profound significance. What is our question? By what authority are you doing? Now, instead of these things, since we're trying to make it personal and applicable to each of us, let's say it this way. Let's substitute this. By what authority are you doing the things that you're doing? By what authority are you doing the things that you're doing? All right, I told Harold I would cue him, so I've got a handout for you all. So he's going to be handing that out. But here's the first observation that you will see once you get your handout that I'd like for us to entertain. And that is this question: by what authority are you doing the things that you're doing? Friends, that is always an appropriate question. That is always an appropriate question. And here's why I want us to begin with that observation. Because, friends, this historic episode, let's face it, again, this is where we're deriving our question from. But let's face it, that historic episode, it has some dynamics that might cause us to look at our question in less than a favorable view. Again, let's notice a few. What about who's asking the question? You see, in this historic episode, those who are asking the question, that might tend to negatively impact how we see the question. Remember who they were? The chief priests, the elders, the scribes. Friends, who were those men in relationship to Jesus? They were some of his constant, relentless, hostile enemies. They're the ones who are asking the question. Friends, these groups of Jewish leaders were repeatedly attempting to disparage our Lord in the eyes of the people. They were constantly scheming and even seeking his demise. And friends, even that very week, they are going to be the ones who are orchestrating his death in the coming days. So knowing that they're the ones, it's on their lips that we hear the question, that might not cause this question to be a very favorable one to us. But then also, what about why they were asking? Why were they asking this question? Because that also might adversely influence our opinion toward the question. Now, I have to issue a word of caution here, friends. We have to be careful when we are ascribing motives to other people's actions. Well, we're not told why they ask, but I hope I'm not being too presumptuous, because I think it's pretty obvious. I think it's pretty apparent, friends. These men, these groups of Jewish leaders were not asking Jesus for information. That's not why they were asking the question. And the reason I would submit that, friends, is because Jesus had previously, on many occasions, in his encounters with these very groups, he had assured them that whenever he acted only as God, his Father, had commanded him. So I do not think they're asking for information. They had heard Jesus answer that question many times in his affirming that he always acted in harmony with his Father's authority and his Father's commands. So it's not that they didn't know the answer. So why did they ask? Well, I do agree with one preacher, Ricky, that I heard comment one time. He said he kind of hears this question coming from those Jewish leaders ask in this way: who exactly do you think you are, Jesus? And I think he's probably right. That's what they were asking. In light of his triumphal entry, in light of his cleansing the temple, in light of his healing and accepting these accolades from people, in light of his assuming to be a teacher of the people, I think they were asking, who exactly do you think you are? Now, if that's their reason, if that's why they're asking, again, the question itself might not be one that's very favorable to us. But then what about how Jesus responded to the question? Does that have any bearing on how we look at the question itself? Because it might be a bit puzzling to us. Does Jesus answer the question? He does not. In this setting, he does not answer the question. Look there at the end of verse 27, and that's exactly what it says. From Jesus' own words, he says, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." So again, here is something else that might somehow impact how we look at the question. When Jesus was asked the question, he doesn't answer them. He doesn't answer the question. Now, why do you think that is? Well, again, I think it's kind of obvious from the dialogue and what is recorded for us, friends. I think Jesus knew their hearts. I think Jesus knew they were not sincere in asking him this question. In fact, friends, may I submit that he's going to expose their hypocrisy when they are unwilling to answer his conditional question. You remember what he says? Remember how he did respond? He goes, "I'll answer your question if you answer mine." And so he gives them his question, and guess what? They don't answer his question. And again, he exposes, or at least the text exposes for us, the hypocrisy as to why they would not answer Jesus' question. They weren't being sincere. They weren't being honest in this whole exchange here. And so Jesus, I believe, chose not to answer because of that. But here's my point, friends. These details of who and why and what, these details corresponding to the questions being asked on this occasion in the original context, it might leave a rather sour taste in our mouth. And that could promote an unsavory view of the question itself. Please don't let that happen. Please don't let that happen. Friends, do not allow these particulars from the historic episode to in any way diminish our value of this question. Do not allow those details in any way to discount the appropriateness of this question. Friends, this question, point number one, this question, by what authority do you do the things that you do, is always appropriate. In fact, may I make it stronger than that? It's not just appropriate, friends. This is an absolutely essential question. And here's why I affirm that. Because of the indispensable role of authority in every realm of our lives. Authority, friends. As you know, authority speaks to the established power, the approved governance by which an individual determines what they are supposed to do. And again, friends, such established power, such authority is needed for orderliness and governing cohesion in every realm of our lives. And I think you well know, but there are a lot of folks who aren't fans of authority. You know of some? Individuals that are not very fond of submitting to established authorities. But if I ever encounter individuals like that and I feel comfortable that I can speak to them, here's my question. Would you like to live without authority? Because, friends, the only alternative to authority is anarchy. Anarchy. Friends, in the absence of an established authority, what we should expect and what we are going to witness is anarchy. Think about it. Friends, if we do not know by what authority we are to act, if we do not know where to look to ascertain that established power for doing what we're doing, the inevitable consequences of that, the inevitable result of that is going to be chaos. It's going to be disorder. It's going to be lawlessness. Again, it's going to be anarchy. And friends, that is going to be true in every facet of our lives. Now, I know traffic down here is not quite what it's like up in Hampton Roads. But I think you can relate. Would you all like to live in a place where there were no traffic laws? For instance, if folks didn't know that you had to ride on the right side of the street, would that bother you? I know up in Hampton Roads, you wouldn't be living long. If everyone wasn't driving according to the established authority on one side of the street, we're going to have a lot of head-on collisions. Or what if we didn't know what speed limit the established authority has set? You know, I spent a lot of time over at my grandchildren, and sadly, that second grader, despite my warning him, does not stop before he runs out in the street. I mean, he mounts his bike in the morning, and I mean, before I ever get out the door, I see him going, never stop to look. Now, here's one thing I'm glad about, Harold. The speed limit there is about 15. But what if there wasn't a speed limit? What if people are coming down that road at 90 miles an hour? And there's a hidden blind spot where he comes down. Friends, that scares me. But that's what you're left with. Without an established authority in any facet of our lives. I spoke of traffic, friends, but this would be true of our government. And I know we have a lot of things that are disheartening to us, a lot of things that are troubling to us about our government. But can you imagine living in a country without a government? Sadly, there are places across this globe. That's the life that people are left to live with. And again, it's anarchy, mob rule. And friends, we could apply it to our homes, we could apply it to our work, we could apply it to school, we could apply it to any arena of our lives. Because again, authority is an indispensable role for us to have orderliness and governance in any area of our lives. That being true, here's the one we're focusing on, friends. Because it is especially true in religion. In religion. And please appreciate that was the realm in which these individuals were asking Jesus this question. It was in the realm of religion. By what authority are you doing these things in religion? By what authority? Who gave you that authority? And so, friends, that is going to be the primary focus of our examination of this question. It's going to take on the idea of by what authority do we do what we do in religion? And friends, again, let me very unequivocally state that in the realm of religion, this question is always appropriate. In fact, more than that, it's essential. It's essential. Now, we need to stop for this morning, and I didn't get very far, so I don't know, my brief series of sermons might go a little longer than I anticipated. But I want to offer two lines of reasoning, if you will, two lines of evidence that help us understand that this question, especially in the area of religion, this question is always appropriate. Again, not just appropriate, but essential. Again, a preview for Lord willing next week, but those two lines of evidence is, number one, history. History attests to this truth, but not only that, heaven. Heaven assures us of this truth, that this is a question we need to be asking. And I'm really sorry we didn't get to that one, Harold, because that's why I asked you to lead the song that you did. Whatever you do, in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. I hope you know where that comes from. That's a Bible verse. That's heaven's assuring us of this important truth about this question. But we need to stop this morning, pray that this whets your appetite for what I hope you will find to be, again, a very practical, a very timely consideration of a question that we not only need to be asking ourselves, but friends, we need to be comfortable enough to be asking others. Why do you do what you do in the area of religion? But first and foremost, that question needs to be asked by each of us, to ourselves. Why do we do what we do? And again, that song hopefully establishes where that authority derives from and why it is so important for us to ensure that we are always acting by that authority.